Metroidvania is a genre that has become popular with indie game developers. Of course, not because it's an easy genre to master. In fact, I would argue that it can be one of the most challenging genres to get right. I've encountered many titles that undertake the task but fall short due to their map design or gameplay feel. So when I encounter an actual good game in the Metroidvania genre, I can't help but tell everyone who will remotely listen. Ultros follows a nameless protagonist who has crash-landed on a mysterious planet under mysterious circumstances. It's not long before the protagonist learns that this planet seems to be stuck in some kind of a loop, forcing everyone to relive various moments of the planet's history. Now, players must search for upgrades and free themselves from the loop before they are doomed to stay there forever. I'm not gonna lie, the game felt inspired mainly by Metroid. While there are some characters to talk to, like a gardener who takes care of the plants in his garden, there isn't much character interaction, giving the entire game this isolated feeling. This actually only gets more pronounced when the main character is the only one who remembers any of the past events of the loop. So that means that players will have to relive some of the same dialogue from the few characters that can be spoken with. This isolated atmosphere is challenging to nail down, especially when adding in other characters, but Ultros ends up managing all the narrative loops with grace. Even if the story is a little light, the overarching mystery of the time loops kept me interested throughout the journey, even when I was inevitably getting lost in the environment. This time loop also affects gameplay. It activates every single event, taking players back to the beginning of the game. All upgrades are lost until found again, and any unlocked path will be locked. However, a prominent gameplay feature is gardening. The plants players can grow can create new platforms, vines to swing off of, or be used for food to heal. The most significant benefit is that even if a loop activates, they can still grow if given nutrients before the next reset. This creates an interesting dynamic as players can create shortcuts or paths to upgrades using these plants. Fresh mechanic is a perfect way for players to feel progression. In fact, I found myself attempting to figure out what plants were best to grow before I activated another major event. The only downside is that these choices are permanent at the beginning of the game with only a few upgrades, so any plants that could have been better used elsewhere will be stuck until players can uproot the plant. This means that if players choose to grow a plant later on, they'll have less time as the time loops become less frequent. However, a special item called compost can speed up the time to grow a plant, which is especially handy if players need food to heal up before a boss battle. I mentioned it briefly, but food is an important part of Ultros that goes hand in hand with gardening. Food has a dual purpose though, to heal and to gain nutrients to buy upgrades. Each of these foods have a nutrient value that can add to a bar with 4 separate values for stat increases. Each upgrade will require a certain amount of these nutrients and can be purchased at save points. These nutrient upgrades vary between damage and health ups to abilities such as backstabs. Like any other upgrade, they will disappear upon a loop reset. However, players can choose which abilities to retain if they collect a certain item known as memory lock. That will lock an ability, allowing players to retain it upon each loop, which means that players have more resources later to unlock more abilities in the tree. These locks are usually found out of the way, and with a few exceptions require exploration of an area to find. The scarcity significantly makes this item very valuable when it reduces the food needed to fully upgrade the protagonist during each loop. Certain foods can feed creatures and create fertile soils for players' crops. Of course, plants aren't the only food source that players can use. Food comes in many sources, including the beasts roaming the lands, where players will need to mix up their attacks to get a best quality meat. This system evolves over the course of the game, as most creatures in the beginning will need repeated hits to take down, and players will only have a few attacks at their disposal, leaving most enemies a bloody pulp. However, once more abilities are learned, obtaining the best spoils from creatures becomes much easier, especially when the combat feels as fluid as it does. While it doesn't get very complicated, abilities help keep the combat feeling fresh, especially when the enemy variety is lacking. However, unlike other titles, I didn't mind this. Instead, it felt more like a discovery how to effectively slaughter each animal to collect their meat before deciding which ones would be more useful alive. I like this dynamic because instead of viewing enemies as obstacles, I had become a part of the ecosystem as I hunted my prey carefully to avoid ruining the balance. Ultros was a pleasant surprise as a roguelike Metroidvania. The balance between hunting and gardening creates an interesting dynamic not found in other titles of this genre. This means that combat and enemy variety can feel lacking initially, but will likely become a non-issue for players as they explore the beautifully created areas. I see this game becoming a classic that speedrunners and casual players alike will likely fall in love with. Noisy Pixel is giving Ultros a 9 out of 10. Thanks for watching. This video is brought to you by our supporters on Patreon. Noisy Pixel is run by a group of gamers providing independent gaming coverage through news, reviews, previews, and more. Check out our Patreon to help support our continued growth and subscribe to keep up with all our future content.
Noisy Pixel.